making the effort to come. Today I was, while coming here on the train, I was thinking that it's Gandhi Jayanti, and it was, I think, quite inadvertently the case. But I thought it was appropriate that we give some thought to the man's ideas, much as I disagree with so many of them. But I think in the context of the times we live in, which are ecologically more threatened by the day, it's probably appropriate to remember Gandhi's adage, there's enough in the world for everyone's needs, but not enough for everyone's greed, or in principle for anyone's greed, because one man can be greedy enough to want to planet. What I thought I'll do is to speak for about 45 minutes. Is that all right? And then we can have a discussion, because I think things will come up in discussion which I will forget to talk about. I want to begin by sharing a story with you. And this story is from a conference I attended last year in South Korea. This was the World Conservation Congress. And I was quite struck by the fact that the bulk of the delegates of this conference were actually corporate people. This was organized by the IUCN, which is, one of the flagship global environmental organizations. And there were, mining companies, there were infrastructure firms, there were water companies, banks, and hedge funds as well. And they had something called Knowledge Cafe, which was a sort of informal setup by the beach. You sit under these colorful umbrellas, and there's a topic on each umbrella, and if you like that topic, you can go and chat about it. So under one of these was a gentleman who happened to be a hedge fund manager. So when we got acquainted, I asked him, what is someone like you doing here? And his response was that he was a nature lover and animal lover and so on. But he said, I'll have to tell you a story in order to explain why I'm here actually. So this is the story. Some 15 years back, he's sitting at a restaurant in Boston with 3 friends, and they are ordering food, and each one of them orders food from a different continent. Somebody gets Norwegian salmon, somebody gets Argentinian beef. What was interesting was nobody ordered anything from North America. Certainly not something boring like clam chowder or something from the Iranian. So he said, I found that strange, so some kind of penny dropped in his brain. And then most of the conversation that evening was about debt. Who owes how many millions to whom, and over what period they have to pay the debt, etc. When the time came to pay the bill, everybody pulled out their credit card. So he said that's when the second penny dropped, which is how do people with so much debt have any credit? And then he said quickly a third penny dropped, which was there is some connection between the animals we ate over dinner and the fact that we are all heavily in debt and still have the privilege of using credit cards. So he said, I realized immediately that we were having all along jet-lagged food. That was his expression. Because the food was coming from 5,000 or 10,000 miles away, had been grown in sort of strange environments, had been stored, irradiated, transported, stored again, treated, etc. His name was Adam. So Adam's point was that he said, as in my day job as a hedge fund manager, I realized I was doing something criminal. I was actually enabling the wealthy to get wealthier by investing their funds in more lucrative areas. And he said he drew two graphs in his mind. So I'm just going to put them on the board. Can you see this from back there? So if on this axis you measure time and you say start around 1970, and on this axis you measure the expansion of money, supply of money in the economy from the early 1970s. It's talking about the US economy, but think about the world economy too. And on the other axis you put strange thing. Species extinction. So it says, if you look at the expansion of money since 1970, it's an exponentially rising curve. And specifically since 1971, August 1971, when the dollar is unused from gold, when the American Federal Reserve refuses to convert dollars into gold for overseas holders of dollars, especially the Germans and the Japanese, who accumulated large number of dollars from their sale of goods to the US. The US having lost much of the competition in automobiles, machine tools, whole range of areas in the late 60s. So that's the sort of expansion of money. And interestingly enough, Adam says, in the outer quadrant, there's an exponentially declining curve when we look at the extinction of species. I think I was reading today while waiting for the train in the bookstore, somebody, I think the editor of Scientific American, talking about how 200 species are being lost a day now, and the number rises every week, and so on. So, this, so to speak, is Adam's story, and he quickly set up a conservation fund called Synchronicity Earth, which you can actually Google, and it's quite interesting, this site. And the idea was to actually try to save species with the money being earned over there, right? And he realized that you have to protect habitats, not just species, if you want to protect species. And so they do a lot of habitat protection work and stuff. But what I want to talk about here is something which I think is critical if you want to understand India's predicament today, or indeed any country which is integrated with the global economy today. Financialization is fundamental to understand. So, since I imagine most of you are not economists, what I'll do is to just indicate by analogy, through a sort of metaphor, the way you might think about this. So think of what money is first of all, and remember that what you're carrying in your wallet by way of currency notes and coins is actually not even 5% of the total amount of money in circulation. In fact, it would probably be less than 3% or so. Even if you include the credit cards which you use for payment, you will still not get to 10%. Most of the money in today's world is completely abstract and is, strictly speaking, just a numerical adjustment in cyberspace. It's just an accounting mechanism, so to speak. So it's a transfer of economic control, so to speak, over ledgers on the cyberspace. So that's the first thing to understand, that certain technology has now come into being, which everybody uses, and which allows for the creation of money in all sorts of unpredictable ways. And more than 90% of the money is now being created by the private sector, not directly by the government. There is, of course, a Federal Reserve, there is a central bank, but it exercises certain regulation. And beyond that, it's, to use a slang, a pay for all. So anybody who has access to funds is in a position to create money. How so? Well, the moment a loan is made, money is created. Now, if you think about it, money is not just a medium of exchange, it's not just a unit of account, it's not just a store of value. Most importantly, it is debt. And if you read what's written on the currency note, there will always be a claim that you are given when you hold that note with you. And the claim is to be met by the Reserve Bank or the Central Bank of the country. Right? So if you think of money as debt, and if you think of the explosion of debt, okay, which is what the explosion of money effectively means, then what is that a claim on? Right? You have to ask that question. So one answer is, well, man-made income and wealth. In other words, the GDP of the country, the gross domestic product of the country. True enough. But if you have too much money being pumped into the economy, as has been the story since the breakdown of the fixed exchange rate system in 1971, when the dollar is taken off the gold, so you have too much money being pumped into the system, you have an expansion of claims on a stream of wealth or income which is not growing nearly as fast as money itself, money being just a symbol. So where do those claims go? And this was, I think, Adam's insight, because I hadn't thought about it in these terms till I heard this from him. So where does this money go? The money actually becomes in some way a claim on something beyond just what human beings are producing. Right? Much more than what the GDP can actually redeem, so to speak. So then it becomes increasingly a claim on the natural world. And there are various complex financial mechanisms which I don't want to go into, through which these claims are exercised. So some of you might have heard of debt for nature swaps since the 1980s and so on. So if some third world country is heavily in debt, somebody is willing to buy their debt and bail them out, provided access to their forests or wetlands or something is given to some organization here in the Western world. Right? So that's just one way in which it is done. There are many other ways. And one of the things I learned at this conference last year was that what they call the green economy or the greening of the economy is very often the financialization of nature itself. We've already seen the commodification of nature since the Industrial Revolution, increasing monetization of nature, creation of markets in all sorts of things, from land to water to air and so on. And increasingly now markets are being defined on everything under the ocean floors, and futures markets are being defined. All sorts of complex mechanisms are being created to sort of appropriate the wealth of nature itself. And behind this is a profound economic crisis, and that crisis has to do with the fact that you have stagnant demand in the economy. The economy is capable of producing a lot more than people are able to purchase. And that's a function of the fact that the income and wealth distribution of virtually every country has been getting worse, and the distribution between countries is also getting worse for the last generation or so. Now, maybe we'll come back to it because there's a lot more to say about what's happened to the world economy since the 1970s. But the analogy I want to leave you with is, think of oil, or rather gas, as you say in America, in an automobile. So, every automobile needs gas and a certain amount, and the tank may be able to carry 50 or 60 liters or something. Now imagine you keep pumping gas into the car. At some point, the engine is going to seize. If you put 500 liters of gas, the engine will not run. There will be all sorts of overflow problems and so on. So think of money in the same way in the economy. Right? If there is too much of it, it causes a problem. If there's too little of it, it also causes problems. So you have to get some sort of optimal balance. Right? What we do know about the economy since the 1970s is that this variable is completely out of whack, and has enabled things which were not even possible to dream of a generation ago, such as the fact that Americans can now buy, on the basis of imaginary wealth, which is to say money that they create, other people's goods almost indefinitely. So China has been running this massive trade deficit, trade surplus with the US, basically sending lots of goods and services here and getting just US dollar in return, no goods really to speak of. So massive anomaly has been created in the financial accounts. The result of which is that China today has a $3.5 trillion reserve, which, in the words of a Chinese economist I met last month, is actually not even worth the paper. So people know that the US currency is actually bankrupt, but there is not a whole lot the Chinese can do about it without destroying themselves. So if they, try to get rid of those dollars, that will, plunge the, value of their own assets, which are in dollars. So here's the catch as far as the reserve currency role of the dollar is concerned. No other currency in history has exercised this sort of global hegemonic influence. Right? So this is the sort of first part of what I want to say in relation to India now. What's important to remember is that India integrates with the global economy from about mid-1980s, since Mrs. Gandhi's assassination. And it really accelerates after 1991 when there is a major payments crisis and we do not have the foreign exchange, the hard currency, to get more than 2 weeks of imports. Right? And that's when we go to the IMF and try to ship our gold out secretly in order to get the hard currency to pay for oil and computers and airplanes, things without which the Indian economy will screech to a halt. So the time at which India integrates with the global economy is a time when the global economy is financializing at a very rapid pace. And India does not have an option. If you want to live in that sort of a sea, you have to allow the sharks, so to speak, to participate in whatever you've got. So this is what happens, and I want to quickly sort of make the link to the rupee crisis that India is going through right now. Those of you who have been following the news in the pink pages will know that over the calendar year 2013, all the way till September 18th or so, the rupee lost almost 20% of its value vis-a-vis the dollar. And it has been the cause for major panic in Indian business and industry and chambers of commerce and the entire policy elite of the country. Now, should this have surprised anybody? Which is the question to ask. And the point is that this was actually foreseeable for at least a decade, if not more. Because the story for India is like this. The last time that India had a trade surplus, which is to say it was exporting more than it imported, was in 1977. Which is roughly the time that China had its last trade deficit. We are fond of making comparisons with China, but don't forget that China's $3.5 trillion of reserves is their own money, and whatever foreign exchange reserves the Indian governments have been boasting of is actually somebody else's money. Somebody has decided to park their cars in your parking lot briefly, and they will withdraw it once the shine is gone. Now, what I want you to understand is this, that the growing trade gap between imports and exports has to be financed. How do you pay for the excess imports in a world which will not accept anything but hard currency? Right? So you get loans, you expect investments to come, and so in other words, something happens in the capital account which compensates for the deficit on the current account of the payments of the country. Are you with me, or?
Could you say that last bit?
Yeah. So let's say your imports are, going like that, and the exports are growing like this over time. So you have this growing trade gap, right? and you have to think about financing it. So how are you going to do it? You take a loan, or you take some aid, or you expect investment? Yeah, so that's basically. So, if you read the Indian business press, or indeed any Indian English language press, you will find that the government is constantly worried about not being able to please investors, right? The whole rush to get foreign investment, it's not just because they believe in neoliberalism, it's not just because they believe that private capital will sort out problems. Actually, a lot of the time they don't believe that. The real reason is that the trade gap has to be met. And if there isn't hard currency constantly coming in, it's a form of life support. If the hard currency doesn't come in, you will have major problems in running your economy from week to week. If oil prices shoot up, you will get inflation, and the government might fall in election year, etc. There's all sorts of political consequences from that, and no government wants them. So I would say that every government since the mid-1980s has been actually making its policies in a state of relative unacknowledged panic. And what happened this year, beginning May, when the Federal Reserve made a monetary policy announcement here in the US that it was actually tapering off the expansion of money, cheap money policies, which have led to this, that it was actually turning that down. Since then, the rupee has been declining very sharply, right? Why? Well, because if you don't have cheap money here in the West, interest rates here rise. Okay? Interest rates here rise means that investors who manage their funds globally will think of this as a relatively more attractive investment, given that assets are much safer here than in a third world country. So the interest rate has to rise by just 0.5% or 1% to make a huge difference to the capital outflow from third world setting like India, right? So the sensitivity of the Indian economy to the mood and policy changes here in the US has suddenly heightened in a way that was not true a generation ago. So part of being an open economy today in India means to actually weather all this, to actually be able to take all the ups and downs of the global system and its function. Now, a country like China does not face this difficulty, and the reason it does not have to face this is not only because its reserves are huge, so it doesn't have to beg, borrow hard currency to pay any deficits. They don't have deficits. They have surplus. They're bailing out other countries. Not just that, but also because they have very strict capital controls. You can't just take a lot of money into China and put it out next week if the going gets bad. In India, they're trying to create a system where you can do that, and they're bending over backwards to please investors globally. Right? The only country which has actually, or rather, the country which has managed to come out of the 1997-98 financial crash in Southeast Asia best is Malaysia, because it has executed strong capital controls. And most economists in their right mind will tell you that, take something like Joe Stiglitz, he will tell you that financial liberalization, for third world countries is going to spell disaster at some point or another. Despite that, Indian policy, at least throughout, has been trifling with this idea of opening up the capital account to foreign investors, which means that the going might be very good for some time, and the honeymoon may last 6 months, 1 year, maybe longer. But when the money exits, it can destroy your economy. So that's the power of money in terms of the way it determines the fate of the quote-unquote real economy in a modern economic system. Right. So the loss of, shall we say, policy sovereignty that has come in the wake of globalization is one of the themes we try to discuss in the book at some length. And we argue that we need a completely different policy framework if you actually want to address the difficulties and hardships that our people back home are facing in so many millions of ways. We argue that so long as the policy framework in India remains tethered to financial globalization, to free capital mobility and such things, we cannot actually address local and domestic needs in any fair way. The policy space is completely taken up with that. The collateral damage of the functioning of this globalized Indian economy is what the vast majority of our people are having to face. So that's what our book examines, and what I'm going to do now is to tell you a little bit about how we have sort of evaluated the impact of globalization in the last generation in India. And I'm going to do it in two parts, by looking at the socio-economic impact and then talking about the ecological impact. The two are intimately related, but just for purposes of exposition, I'll do it separately. I said a while ago that if you have a productive economy which is able to actually produce much more than it is able to sell, you have a problem. You have a demand issue. Who is going to buy what you're able to produce? And as Henry Ford said, if you don't pay your workers enough, there's nobody to buy the cars. Right? Now, that in good measure is not only India's problem today, it's the world's problem. And the rising inequality of income and wealth are not just matters of social injustice, they're also matters of the survival of the system that we call capitalism. Can capitalism survive without actually enabling large-scale purchasing power to a large number of people? And in one word, the answer is no, but if you look at data, it's very interesting. Starting with the US in the 1970s. The 1970s, I keep going back to, is the critical decade in which everything changes for capitalism. Starting in the 1970s, after a series of crises like the two oil crisis, the stagflation that followed it. Stagflation is basically economic recession plus inflation. You got to a situation in the US where the wages of workers were frozen in real terms, corrected for inflation, workers' wages stopped rising. The first time in 150 years that the standard of living of working people and the middle class in the US actually did not rise from one decade to the next. That starts happening in the 1970s. And since the end of the 70s, right up until now, 35 years later, you have a situation of flat real wages in the US, while the economy is becoming overtly much more productive. Yes?
That's just in the US?
No. Wait. It's happening everywhere. But in the US, it's the most pronounced. So now, in light of what I just said about demand and inequality, it should be obvious to you that the system was facing a demand crisis by the early 1980s. So what did they do? They got out of it by creating debt. Yeah? So this picture that Adam drew becomes relevant again. How did they do it? They basically made those same workers who would have bought the cars with their wages buy the cars on loans. So the explosion of consumer debt in the form of credit cards and so many other kinds of debt, that really happens since the late 70s. So it was a double whammy for workers, right? You first freeze their wages and then you saddle them with debt. And then in the last episode, before the 2008 crash, what happened? From the beginning of the century after the dot-com bust, all the way to 2008, what the Federal Reserve was doing in the US was, through cheap money policies, through easy loan policies, building up what was called home equity. So everybody was using their homes as a potential asset and consuming in the belief that their homes and their assets are rising so rapidly in value that it's possible to go on consuming more and more. So the debt bubble kept growing with that, and various financial instruments were created to actually exploit this debt bubble. What is called mortgage-backed securities, the whole phenomena of toxic assets and so on, which must be read about in the press. That really explodes between the beginning of the century and 2008. And then suddenly the subprime crisis in 2007 and then the collapse of Lehman Brothers in September of 2008 meant that that massive expansion comes to an end, collapses. And there's a period, I remember September, October of 2008, for about a 6-week period, trade around the world had completely frozen. You just could not get even call money, money which is normally expected by banks from each other, or the credit you need to carry on international trade, from day to day. So you find these cars piling up in the ports and so on. So basic everyday exchanges of the international economy froze because of the financial collapse. So one has to understand the fragility of the system, which is so exposed to systemic risk that if a handful of powerful rich investors are able to play with their money in ways which can affect the destinies of not millions but billions of people, that's what has been going on. So you asked if US is the only place which is experiencing it. No, of course not. You take the case of the Eurozone crisis beginning a few years back. And what's the story there? In a nutshell, German and French banks make big loans to Southern Europe, right? And just like the Chinese have been lending to the US, and the US has been buying Chinese goods, right? German and French banks have been lending to Southern Europe in order to get their own goods purchased by foreigners, right? Now, again, if income distribution in these countries was more fair, you will need to build too many export markets in order to grow your economy, right? But if you have limited demand within the country, then you go out looking for rich people elsewhere who will buy your stuff. If there aren't rich people elsewhere, what do? Well, you make a loan and you get them to buy it on loan. So this has become the standard model through which debt bubbles are created around the world, sustain a period of demand, sustain a certain collective friction for a while, and then that bursts, and then the bubble moves elsewhere, and then that bursts, and so on it goes. Right? So, in India, for instance, just before I came, there was a very interesting piece of news. Kumar Mangalam Birla, who is the head of the Birla Group, resigned from the board of the Reserve Bank of India. First of all, one has to ask what is that gentleman doing in the Reserve Bank of India board, but leave that alone. So he resigns from the Reserve Bank of India. And the reason he resigns is that the Birlas are moving into banking. Why are the Birlas moving into banking? Well, because unless you make loans, people are not able to buy on the incomes they have what they want to sell. So just like GM did in the US, or so many other companies in the US have, credit schemes run by corporations. Not pay as you go, but pay later, buy now, etc. That sort of thing has become much the norm for the whole world. So one has to understand that that's in many ways the default setting. And that's the lazy way, shall we say, to organize a contemporary world, the contemporary economy anywhere, which is to not actually touch any of the fundamentals, leave distributions of income and wealth, the same, and try to grow the economy, and then problems create debt. In other words, postpone the problem or shift the problem. Right? So this crisis of demand is further compounded by one significant factor, which has been a feature of the system everywhere for a long time now and getting worse every week. and that is the growing redundancy of labor. Right? So increasingly around the world, you have jobless growth because of mechanization, automation, and you have jobless recoveries. So companies take advantage of the fact that on the downturn, people are laid off, and when the upturn comes, they don't rehire those people back. So for instance, traditional Marxist notions of the reserve army do not apply, because the reserve army idea has to do with the fact that there's a pool of workers who, when they get laid off, when the business cycle turns up, they will be hired again. But that is not happening now. You have a structural decline in the labor absorbing capacity of the economy. So I'll just give you one piece of data from India which is relevant. If you look at the organized sector of the Indian economy, which is to say units which employ at least 10 people, use electricity, pay income taxes, and so on. What is the total number of people employed by this sector? Let's look at some data. So in 1991, this number is 26.7 million. Okay, not very large. In 2012, a generation of reforms later, right, and some of the best rates of growth, right? Overall rates of growth are very impressive in this period, between 5 and sometimes 9%. Yeah? This number rises to a mere 29 million. So you have a net increase in jobs of 2.3 million over a 21-year period. And I might add, of these 29 million, only 11 million are employed in the organized private sector. The rest are in government. So all the noise you hear about liberalization, privatization, globalization, and the great things it has achieved in India actually is affecting directly in a positive way only these people. What is the size of the workforce meantime? In 1991, it is roughly 325 million. And by 2012, it is somewhere between 450 and 500 million, depending on how the labor force is estimated. And you do the math. It's less than 7% of your economy which is employed in the organized sector, right? And for all the noise our politicians and business leaders make about, why growth is necessary for job creation, princely sum of 2.3 million is the increase in the number of jobs. And the private sector still employs just 11 million people. So the retort comes from, people in the establishment that put their body in retort. They say, no, but wait, we're just counting the workers in the organized economy, count also the impact on the unorganized economy. So there is some data on that. But even if you multiply this number by 10, okay, so for every job created in the organized economy, 10 jobs have been created in the unorganized economy. Suppose you still have only 23 million jobs created over this 21-year period. Right? But the actual data is worse than this. There's an organization called NASSCOM, which is the Association of Software Manufacturers, if you will know. According to their data, the total number of employees in the organized sector of IT is 2.8 million, and 8.9 million is the total employed in the unorganized sector. So ratio of roughly 1 to 3.5. And this is in the flagship sector of the economy, the sector which has been growing one of the fastest. Sorry.
What is the 8.9 million?
8.9 million is the total number of jobs created in the unorganized sector from the 2.8 million jobs created in the organized IT sector. This is just IT, just for in information technology. The model of the story is, and all these numbers, by the way, are from the economic survey of the Ministry of Finance. So the model of the story is very, very, very obvious, and actually you don't need to go much further to understand why trickle down can never work in India, and why all economists are wrong on this, who don't seem to openly talk about the fact that growth is not spreading. These are bad numbers in any context. In today's context, with an exploding young population, these are terrible numbers. Right? And the social and political impact of this is already beginning to show. When you hear Raj Thackeray, kicking out Biharis from Mumbai, or you have conflict between Assamese and Bengalis in Assam, so many other contexts. You have regional chauvinisms growing, Indian species and varieties of fascism growing, and behind it is what? Very high unemployment among the youth, especially male youth who will not know how to direct their energies if they don't get the right opportunities. So you have this massive crisis building up, and you have headhunting firms like Team Services and Pune saying that by 2020 India might have up to 150 million educated unemployed. Now think about what that means, right? So that's the scale of the jobs crisis, and that's how meager is the contribution of the mainstream economy, right? And there's very little discussion on this in official circles. Yeah.
So what else would the opposition say? Well, aside from that it's not just the organization, you have to look at the unorganized. What else do they say that's supporting?
No, one lot more. I mean, they would say, for instance, and here it's not just the government, it's also big name economists who will say, well, when there's so much growth in the economy, you can collect more taxes. And with those taxes, the government can create schemes for those who are left out of the mainstream economy, right? So you have the employment guarantee scheme, for instance, which has shown some success in some parts of the country, depending on where you look and how the scheme is designed. But equally, it has created new problems, which we can talk about a little bit in the discussion. It has created some very serious problems in some cases. Be that as it may, my point here is that actually you will not be able to correct these structural defects in the economy with those ameliorative welfare schemes. Certainly not in India, which has never been a welfare state. Then how do you correct it? Hang on, before you look for answers, understand the problem. Right? The three mechanisms through which high overall growth can actually trickle down to the poor, i.e. direct employment, secondly employment through indirect connections with the unorganized economy, and thirdly government intervention through employment guarantee schemes. All three are actually failing right now. And one is reminded of John Kenneth Galbraith, who was Kennedy's ambassador to India, saying that expect trickle down to work is a bit like feeding golden oats to a horse and expecting sparrows to forage in the dung. So that's actually very accurate when you look at the data. If you look at global data on trickle down, it's also very interesting. The World Bank has the data on their definition of poverty. And according to one definition of poverty, this is approximately $2 a day in purchasing power terms. The New Economics Foundation in London has used that data to translate it into trying to see what part of overall growth actually trickles down to the poor, globally speaking. So what they did was to look at what happens to the bottom 40% from the dollar's growth overall. And what they find is this. between 1981 and 2001, if the total growth in the world economy is $45, then 1 out of $45 ends up with the bottom 40%. And if you compress the period to 1991 to 2001, then out of $166, $1 ends up with the bottom 40%. In other words, trickle down is getting thinner. Or put it differently, you have to bribe the rich much more to reduce poverty by the same amount. Because that's what the argument is, right? You make the rich richer so that they will invest more, so that more jobs will be created, more growth will happen. That's the argument. Right? But this is the evidence on the argument. So it's very unlikely that India can actually break this with, ameliorative measures. Somebody is digging the hole much faster than it can be filled through those steps. Yeah.
So, very similar to what has happened in recent times, you think in the next few years it's just going to implode and implode the worst?
Let's get to it. I don't want to anticipate too much before going through the whole evidence. What we also do in the book is to look at basic things like availability of food, right? And the three sets of numbers which I can summarize for you here. One is the calorie intake per capita. And if you look at calorie intake per capita, it's either constant or it is actually declined in some parts of the country since the early 1990s. Which is one reason why they are not using physical calorie intake to estimate poverty, because it reveals too much. Right? If you look at per capita availability of food grains and pulses, in most parts of the country it is either constant or it has declined since 1991. If you look at malnutrition data, it's either constant or declining in most parts of the country. Malnutrition among children, malnutrition among lactating mothers, etc. Anemia among women, constant in the 70-odd%, women in the reproductive age. When you put all this to the planners and the elites, what do they say? For instance, calorie intake is shocking. What do they say? The argument is that, India has been mechanizing, especially in agriculture. So people are actually having to work physically less hard. So they need less calories. So what we did was to go to the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, in this master data set and try to see if there is even one example in history of a country which is becoming more prosperous and is actually experiencing lower calorie intake. And there's not one example like that. So clearly India has bucked the trend for reasons best understood by the planners. So that's the evidence on food. Now I want to move to the next part of the impact of globalization, which is the consequences for the environment. And again, I'll summarize a lot of data and discussion in just one statistic. The World Bank, which is not going to exaggerate this, did a survey recently and came out with a report in July, a few months back, in which they looked at the loss that is entailed by two kinds of environmental degradation. They looked at the loss of environmental health due to air and water pollution, and they looked at the loss of soil productivity and health because of contamination, because of salinization. You can look at 20 other environmental variables, but they don't look at that. For instance, you could look at climate change, you could look at what has happened to forests, wetlands, so many things, but they don't do that. They just look at these two things, and they conclude that if you just account for the losses in these two areas, 5.7% of India's GDP is being lost every year. Right? So effectively all the growth is being neutralized by the environmental losses. Another study along the same lines was published by the Asia Development Bank, also in July. And a third study was done by Cambridge economist Partha Dasgupta. Sometime back, Partha Dasgupta has now been asked by the Prime Minister to head the Green Accounting Commission of the government. What he does is something interesting. He says, okay, if you want to talk about sustainability, what is sustainability? And he defines it in a very interesting way. He said there are three kinds of capital. So there's man-made capital, which is to say plant, equipment, machinery, and so on. There's human capital, which is to say education, training, skills, and so on. And thirdly, natural capital, ecological, natural resources. He says you should be able to add up these three, and there should be a net positive number that should come out of this summation. Right? And that kind of an economy is sustainable. If it comes to net negative, then it's not sustainable. And he finds on that criteria that, and again, he doesn't look at all the environmental variables, but a few more than what the World Bank looked at. And he finds that since the 1970s, Indian growth is actually not sustainable. So we are actually losing capital every year. Yeah.
So how do you verify that the percentages that come up with the environmental loss of climate, how do you verify it's correct?
Well, I mean, it's complicated. I mean, there are methods. If you want, you can go to the Yale website. They have something called the Environmental Protection Index, where a lot of the methodology for these things is elaborated. In fact, I just checked that index this morning, and India's ranking is 125th out of 132 countries on the Environmental Protection Index. Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Pakistan, they're all doing much better than India on environmental protection. Believe it or not, but it's true. So there are ways that environmental modelers are found of measuring these things and then making cross-country comparisons or intertemporal comparisons. So so that's one set of numbers. In our book, we have lots of data on things like water, food, energy, and how water security, energy security, in every area there are declines over a long term. Finally, in relation to environment, I just want to talk a little bit about the climate change uncertainties that are building up around the subcontinent. And some of it is, in popular discussion and known to you. The sinking of the islands in the Indian Ocean and the Bay of Bengal and so on, the flooding of the Sundarbans, which is expected, the coastal flooding, which is going to lead to massive inflow of ecological refugees coming from not just the Indian coastline, but also from places like Bangladesh. Then, the most recent instance of the impact of climate change, ongoing climate change, was the Uttarakhand floods. And while all the details have not been digested and understood, the first cut diagnosis done by meteorologists and climate scientists, based on the work of NASA scientists like Jim Hansen and what the IPCC's own predictions were about rainfall in the future, they have predicted, for instance, that rainfall in the Himalayas is going to rise quite dramatically and become more bunched, become more extreme on a few days, and then not rain for a long time. Irregularity of rainfall, so that the quantum of rainfall in a season may be the same, but the distribution across time is not the same, it's more extreme. We got some evidence of that this year in June, when in 2 days we had 16 centimeters of rain in Uttarakhand. But what local people say and what scientists confirm is that this was not very unusual for Uttarakhand. 60 centimeters is not a lot. They've had 90 centimeters in the past, but not caused this kind of flooding. So what happened this time which was different? And the hypothesis is that you have 10,000 glaciers in the Himalayas. Virtually all of them are melting at different rates. And the glacial lakes, they burst their boundaries, and there is an overflow, and that overfeeds the rivers. It's called GLOF, glacial lake outburst floods. This happened to a lake just above Kedarnath in Uttarakhand, and that flooded the whole Mandakini valley. Nobody knows if 5,000 people died or 15,000, because they won't tell us, but somewhere in that ballpark, between 5,000 and 15,000 people died. Now, how is this related to India's growth strategy and growth process? Well, quite directly, because the way the energy planning or lack of energy planning has been done in the country, Uttarakhand is hosting something like 42 large dams, something like 200 mid-sized dams, and about 300 small dams. A lot of these small dams are described as run-of-the-river projects, which is to say they don't impound the water and ruin the local ecology, but they're actually not run-of-the-river projects. In other words, they're not based on generating power by using the natural incline of rapids, but by actually impounding the water in some way. The dams are being built by doing massive dynamiting and blasting. In the seismically very sensitive mountains, they are the youngest mountains. Roads have to be built in order to ferry stuff, to build the dams. Roads have also been built to ferry more tourists. The tourist explosion in Uttarakhand is about 10 times in the last 15 years. So all that is coming out of the same growth process which we are talking about in the book. So which is why we say this is predatory, if not ecocidal, and very unpredictable in terms of the quantum consequences it can precipitate. This is just one instance of how climate change is working. There are other things going on, such as decline in agricultural yields because of droughts, unpredictable rainfall patterns. The Bihar Chief Minister, last month I was in Patna, and the Bihar Chief Minister goes to survey the floods and comes back and says, "Wo sukha zyada serious hai. The drought is more serious." So you have this peculiar phenomena of flooded rivers and drought in the nearby area, and what explains it is the melting of the glaciers. There's no rainfall to feed the fields, but there's excess water in the river systems because of melting glaciers. There are no irrigation systems to tap the excess water from the melting glaciers to actually enable the productivity of land to be maintained. So you have these peculiar things, and by the way, if you're talking about river ecology, some of you might have followed the news on the sand mining mafia some time back. Where a very bold young woman in the IAS actually named a kingpin of the sand mining mafia in Western UP and was sent on long leave, suspended by the state chief minister. And despite a lot of noise in the media, she remains out of action right now. Sand mining is going on in virtually every Himalayan river I've seen. I went to Himachal and Uttarakhand in the last 1 year. And you can see it. You can see it by day. Earlier you could see it only by night. But now you have truck upon truck literally carting away sand for construction. So this is the problem in looking at GDP in purely quantitative terms, because all this is showing up as a positive on the GDP. The construction industry is booming, right? Or was booming until last year. There are also things like the sale of soil. Topsoil. Bangalore, for instance, gets something like 4,000 trucks of topsoil from surrounding, hinterland in Karnataka for construction. Landscaping of, the green bubbles the rich are pretending to live in and believing that they will survive, the prevailing. So this is the sort of ecological instability which has crept in at very rapid speed because of the sheer scale of ambitions. 40 steel plants are planned for Orissa, 40 thermal plants are planned for Andhra, etc. If even half of these get commissioned, you have a problem, serious problem. So I'm going to head towards the conclusion now and talk about the alternatives maybe in the discussion. The illusion right now in this election year among our highly educated elites is that Modi is the answer. Modi is the problem. And I think the sooner people understand that, the better off we might be. I personally don't think he has much of a chance in the first round of the elections. He might come back on a rebound. The weak Congress-led coalition as a default first government, and then after a couple of years, if that coalition breaks, and if Modi has the patience and the staying power to give up his chief ministership and be in the parliament, stick it out for a few years, then he might come in after that. But if anybody thinks that this man is going to solve problems, he's got it completely wrong. So, first of all, this man does not understand the economy one bit. He has no clue how to manage the economy. Second of all, if you go to Gujarat and you see the Gujarat model working, and the way it works, urban Gujarat is going through one set of experiences, rural Gujarat is going through exactly the opposite set of experiences. Malnutrition, all those things that I was telling you are as bad in rural Gujarat today as they were a generation ago. If you go through the 400-kilometer long Golden Corridor, which runs through eastern Gujarat, you'll realize that the water is not potable, the air is not breathable, there are children being born with 4 fingers and perforated noses because of the high chemical pollution that's going on. And this is the model that Modi wants to bring to the whole of India. So, and also to the extent that Gujarat has succeeded in purely business terms, numerical business terms, those business communities have been working in Gujarat for a very long time. It's got nothing to do with Modi, and many of those communities happen to be Muslim too. So, I think that there needs to be a lot more hard-headed, clear-headed thinking on this, politically and economically, if we are to begin to face the problems that are being created with this sort of growth strategy. What is the alternative? In our book, we have the second part of the book, 3 chapters devoted to discussing this. And roughly, very briefly, our argument is that a market economy left to itself will never actually disclose the true costs of producing anything, because neither the producer nor the seller has any interest in knowing or disclosing the true cost. If a paper mill is polluting the water downstream where some poor communities live, okay, why should it tell the government or anybody what the cost is? And the paper buyer is not interested in getting a higher price for it. Okay? So what we argue is that a market economy will systematically underreport costs along the way. So you need a completely different institutional mechanism to answer the challenges. And that mechanism we give the name ecological democracy. To be more precise, radical ecological democracy. And there's a number of things that involves. For instance, in our 3-tier system of government, the power of the 3rd tier to create laws which are relevant to itself. To have legislative power, not just executive power at the ground level. You should be able to veto a policy which has been made at the top, which is not working in your local interest, etc. There are other features to it, such as ensuring collective rights. If you want to protect resources, you need cooperation, you need collective action. Individuals cannot do it. India is one of the few places in the world which actually has already in its jurisprudence collective rights. So you have, for instance, security of land, at least in law, at least in principle, for the so many tribes we have. Schedule 5 of the Constitution that is guaranteed. Of course, it's disregarded, but it's there in law. You have the Forest Rights Act, which now allows tribal communities to make use of forests, to not, get thrown out of them, etc. Many other things are involved, and we can perhaps talk more about it in the discussion. So let me stop here because we're running out of time, and let's take some questions.
So we have only 30 minutes time,
Right.
so that we can go back to the train station, drop him off. So yeah, first question.
You mentioned that there is not much increase in the people population employed in organized sector during the past decades. But the problem is that there are job opportunities, but there hasn't been the proper investment in the education and healthcare, so that people are not being able to go into those sectors, even though there are many more opportunities coming up in those sectors like in IT. And another reason is that there are too many people employed in the agriculture sector, which is not simply sustainable. So that's why we find that many farmers are doing suicide, and maybe some many other problems, but it's one of the major problems that the number of people who are employed in agriculture sector are not sustainable. So these people need to move out of the organized sector where there are opportunities coming up. But the problem is that due to whatever reason, the deficit in governance or whatever, the thing is that the people are not being provided with the education and healthcare and other development opportunity. And if you compare these numbers with the number of people coming out of the poverty during the past 10, 15 years, 20 years, if you compare with the first 50 years of Indian independence, then there are many more people coming out of the poverty than the first 50 years after the independence.
So you believe the government numbers?
I don't remember the numbers.
No, I'm saying you believe them.
Yeah.
Do you know how they calculate it?
I mean, there are controversy regarding the poverty line, but even if you consider like a wide range, even though you can see on the ground that there are, I mean, even if you ask your older generation, then they will tell you what was the situation before. Now there are many more job opportunities, better job opportunities, and there are some problems. These problems are not due to the reforms, but I guess it's due to the incomplete reforms.
Okay. Let me answer your question in two parts. I think there are two questions there. First of all, just very briefly, we won't have time to go into this in depth. We can communicate on email or something. The poverty numbers of the Planning Commission are a joke. I'll just say that. And just to explain in one instance why they're a joke. People who live in urban areas spend a lot of money on services, right? Water, health, education, transport, at least. Power, right? There is no presence of a single service in the basket of goods and services on the basis of which poverty is computed. Correct? So, for instance, when the Commonwealth Games happened in Delhi 3 years ago, and you evicted thousands of people from their slums, and they were sent 20 kilometers out of town, they were living closer to the workplace earlier. Now they have to commute 3 hours every day, back and forth, and they are paying 20 or 30 rupees more for transport every day. That's not part of the poverty calculation. If you just look at the number, it tells you nothing. You have to look at the consumption basket. 55% of India's GDP is coming from the service sector, and the contribution of the service sector to the basket of goods and services on the basis on which the poverty line is computed is zero. I'm just giving you one instance. I can give you 10 other problems with the way poverty is measured. So that's one part of the answer. The other part of the answer is agriculture use rate. Farmer suicides have nothing to do with the fact that agriculture is intrinsically unproductive. It's false to believe that. How come agriculture becomes productive the moment an agribusiness comes in? How come agriculture is still productive in other countries? What gives first world countries the strength in agriculture? Not comparative advantage according to economic theory, but sheer political power by which they subsidize agriculture to the tune of $1.25 billion a day. And then we make third world countries sign an agreement on agriculture under WTO, back in 1997, right? After which the farmer suicides begin. Before that, show me where the record is of rising farmer suicides. And since 1987, we have 250,000 farmers killing themselves. So the economics of smallholder agriculture have been systematically destroyed in order to make way for the gigantic agribusinesses, Cargill, Archer Daniel Midlands, Nestle, Monsanto, etc., who want to make markets out of India and China. China is a tad wiser than us, but we are all welcoming. Come, take our agriculture, take our markets. So there are systematic policies, and if you read our book, there's a whole long section, 15 pages on agriculture, where we analyze what is happening. For instance, almost 60% of our agriculture is still grain-fed. This is not the case in any other country. The decline in public investment in agriculture is dramatic. It's 5% year on year from the early 1980s to the mid 1990s, and after that, 7% year on year. Without water, there is no agriculture. So, what I'm saying is the neglect of agriculture is not accidental. There is a plan. And the plan is to evict people, to force people through adverse economics to move. Suppose you succeed in moving them, where are you going to employ them? Modern industry cannot employ them. Okay. Also, I've met so many farmers who are in their 50s, 60s, who've never seen the back or front of a school. How are you going to retrain them for anything?
Their sons and daughters can train them.
Hang on, before you get to sons and daughters. What happens then? Suppose you succeed in moving all these people to the cities, other than the jobs crisis, you have another problem. You are then looking at a food production model for India, which is mechanized, right? In other words, energy intensive, right? You need diesel, you need electricity, right? That on the one hand, and you need climate space, right? Think of the year 2030 or 2035. You've got a whole generation of rural Indians who do not know how to do manual agriculture. And you've got an energy crisis and a climate crisis, and you have to feed 1.5 billion people. You do the number, and you say, agriculture does not belong to the future of India. I would argue that if agriculture doesn't have a future, India does not have a future. India will break every theory that has been put against it. It broke socialism before 1990, now it's busy breaking capitalism. So I'm saying that you have to think much more seriously about this. Don't believe the drivel being given to you by the government. Every one of them is lying to you, systematic, and they have interests in lying to you.
So just to add to his comments, so we met P. Sainath last October. He's a leading Indian journalist in the Hindu newspaper, and he was part of the Poverty Commission. And he told us that there were 15 Poverty Commissions set up by the government, and only the recommendation was accepted from the commission which is better for the government to show to the world. Other part is that when I was traveling in India this January, maximum farmers were complaining that there is a labor shortage in the farms and they can't do farming in the area. That's why, like, when there is a harvest season, they can't cut their grains. That's the problem. And there is like a very significant loss because of that issue. Other number that has come from the Health Commission is that before the economic liberalization of 1991, India's malnutrition rate was like reducing. And just after 1991, when it was supposed to be liberated, or everyone was supposed to be happy, the malnutrition rate has increased after 1991.
I agree that these issues are very complex to just simplify into the one argument or the other. But I also think that even if you just take the basic fact that agriculture produces only 30%. I mean, I agree. I think that it's very critical, and that's why I also think that there should be some reforms in the agriculture sector. The thing is that 66% or maybe 60% population is employed in a sector which produces like 30%, as you mentioned there.
Hang on, wait. The pricing of agricultural goods, how is it done? If you look at any industrial product, this pencil, that chair, that mobile phone, the producer has a lot of influence over the price of the product. Right? There are usually oligopolies, 4 or 5 key producers in most industries around the world, and they have a lot of play when it comes to deciding the price at which the product will be sold. Nothing of agriculture. Who sets the price of wheat or rice? Is it the farmer?
I think it's not about the price, it's also the productivity.
Hang on. Is it the farmer? No. It's either the local moneylender, or it's the trader, or it's the corporate, or it's the state government or the national government or the WTO or the Chicago Board of Trade. Right? They are setting farm prices. Right?
That's why I said that.
So what I'm saying is that we live in a very strange world, because if the food critic is getting 10,000 times as much money as the food producer, it's a very strange world. Right? So under that situation, you can show agriculture to be worthless. Because in terms of money, it is not fetching anything, but it's been systematically being discriminated against in countries both capitalist and socialist. Right? And it's been happening everywhere in the world. India is not unique in this respect. The only time that agriculture starts yielding money is when agribusiness gets into it. And then suddenly from some magical source, money appears in agriculture. And don't confuse it with productivity. Productivity is another issue. Chinese, wheat and rice yields, for instance, are twice as much as India. India can have those yields if it wants. If it makes the right investments, it can do that. Farmers' produce is not just a function of how hard the farmer works or how fertile the soil is. It's also a matter of whether water is available, whether diesel is available, etc. And that is something which the government controls.
Actually, my point is the same, that it's a very critical sector and there must be reforms in this sector. And if you observe the reforms, so agriculture is one sector where there have been too few reforms. So that's why I'm saying it's even.
Yeah, but the reforms have to be in a direction which is very different from the direction in which they've gone so far. It's exactly the opposite direction to the one you have in mind. But let's talk more later. Yeah.
Okay. So you talked about that the middle class in the United States is earning. There is no growth in the earning of the middle class in the United States from 1970 onwards. But would you?
In real terms.
In real terms. So yeah, that's my question. So
Middle and working class.
So what is the real terms here? Because if I see there is a good increase in quality of life of the middle class in US with the coming of iPhones or whatnot. So there is a improvement in quality of life, even though they are earning the same amount of money, but their life is better. So would you not consider as an improvement and a growth?
Well, I said that you have to look at how that improvement is financed. And when you look into that, you find the answer is 4-letter word. Debt. So after the 2008 crash, especially, you have what's called deleveraging by consumers. The Fed and the Treasury's main worry right now is what? consumers are simply not spending enough. They want them to spend more. But why are consumers not spending enough? Because they're trying to, reduce their debts.
So it drives a cycle. The debt kind of forces the people to produce and innovate and bring new products into the market which improves the quality of life. So it's not essentially a bad thing. It's kind of driving the economy. And
Well, depends on how you judge it. According to some people reckoning 100 million Americans are now living in poverty. Poverty appropriately measured in contexts like Americans. If the world's most advanced country has that many poor people, you have a problem. Anybody who knows what is going on with the economy is seriously worried. Just like in India, the crisis here is going to recur as well. Nobody should believe that it's all over. Yeah.
Actually, all the argument is understand it correctly. You try to attribute on the what is happening in India right now to the globalization, opening up of country to the global world. But don't you recognize the since 1970 the population has drastically changed as well as our internal problems like corruption, there are so many issues. Why you attribute everything to the
No, I do not actually. One tongue it can only vary in one direction at a time. So I do think population is a huge problem. I did talk about it, but that doesn't mean it's not a problem. But in the context of ecology, and here I go back to Gandhi's original remark I started with, which is just half the population of India, just for hot experimental purposes. Make it 600 million. Do you think we won't have any problems? And get rid of corruption. Do you think we won't have any problems? I think we will have very serious problems. And the reason is that you just have to double the greed and you get the same result. Ecologically speaking. In terms of pressure on resources and climate and so on, you have exactly the same problem. So, population is a symptom of the people problem. Population is a huge problem. I completely agree with you, especially in the cities. In the congestion. Our cities are not cities, they are cancers. So we need to think very creatively and imaginatively about it. In terms of population, for instance, how does China manage? It also has a huge population. One way it manages is by actually building many more growth poles, not just have 5 or 10 large growth centers that India is doing as a default. China has 170 cities, about 1 million people. India has about 40. So what that means is that you don't get congestion like you get in Delhi and Mumbai.
Yeah, the congestion is much bigger.
That may well be. That may well be. But the point is that you can distribute the same population much better across the landscape. And people need to be provided with livelihood where they are rather than having to constantly move. But the modern world has made a fetish out of moving. So the more urbanization, the more developed we are. That's what everybody thinks. And I'm saying, ecologically speaking, we're all wrong if we think like that. Why are we wrong? Because if, suppose, everybody moves to the cities, your hinterland is still the countryside. The coastlines, the wetlands, the forests, and so on. If there are no people living there, you have no early warning systems if there are environmental tipping points. The people who survived the tsunamis were the most uneducated people in the Andaman's, who followed the elephants to the islands. And the people who died were the Swedish tourists who were sunbathing on the beach. Okay. So if you eliminate all communities which are actually somewhat sensitive to nature and still know something about sustainability, unlike those of us who are hyper-educated and know very little about it in living terms, then it's not just a social injustice, it's also that you're creating an ecologically irrational society, a systematically irrational society in the name of building a smarter planet. Yeah.
So I had a different question, but then this point that you made about increasing urbanization being an ecological problem. I've actually read that higher density places are often more efficient, they consume less fuel resources. Because if you're laying lengths of pipe or telecommunications or whatever it is, you have to go to fewer lengths, and with some sort of power law where you don't, for every increase in the number of people, you don't need a corresponding increase in the number of services. It's fewer than you double the population, you don't need to double the number of services. Supposedly.
Sometimes that is true, but there are other things. I mean, I think the baseline level of structured consumption in cities is so high that compensates sometimes for the fact that you were mentioning. Cities in general are consuming way more resources than villages. One will have to see exactly what thing is being talked about in what context and what the right benchmarks are for comparison. Yeah.
So all the solutions that you presented that other countries are doing, like in China, it's all government stuff. It's all stuff that the government is doing.
No, actually, the solutions we discuss in the book are typically community self-provisioning solutions. Communities taking the initiative to do the best for themselves. If you read our book, there are many examples which we don't have time to go into right now. But the danger with all these is that they can be easily swamped by the larger forces that are working around them. There is a village outside Chennai which has become, free of poverty, which has actually eliminated migration from the village, which actually has a common school system, a common water and housing set up for a multi-caste village. But that village is surrounded by expanding Chennai, and it's threatened by developers and property dealers, and unless there are policies to defend this village, it will be bought out in time. So that's the danger with just local community level solutions, because the wider forces of the system are operating on them as well.
It's the wider forces that I was actually talking about. The government, like 60% of our agriculture is grain fed, globalization, you're talking about the right investments within the country. That's like government and the human role and all of that.
Sure.
So what exactly is our government doing, and what could they do, and what's preventing anything?
Yeah, well, our government is making matters worse for people in the countryside, by and large, by actually not thinking about them. I mean, it's taken this teleological view that all these people are going to end up in the cities anyway, and let's improve things in the cities, and rural India can wait. That's the general attitude. Narendra Modi says he wants to make India 90% urban. He says there are no villages in Gujarat now. That's his claim. He quoted in our book. Because he imagines every village has already become a town. He doesn't even visit these places. So the government is actually not thinking of the countryside. And the first step is to begin to see what is actually possible to do where people are actually living.
So I incentivize the government to care about the people.
The way you incentivize the government normally is to bribe them, but the poor don't have the money to bribe them. There will be protest, which is the other thing which they worry about, because they do think about votes once every 5 years. They have to. So in this election year, they're passing one popular law after another. It's a complicated situation, and there are no easy answers, and there are lots of false solutions, and lots of money is being made by selling these false solutions. Yes. The problem with NRHS in some places is what you were mentioning, which is that it's actually taken away the incentive to work. Because money from agriculture is so low, if you're getting 120 rupees a day from NRHS, why would you want to work on somebody's farm? So agricultural labor is a problem. And there are other problems to do with corruption, but then they apply across government schemes, not just NRHS. Yeah.
See, much of the pushback is NRHS action. Because, when you say you go talk to a farmer and they say, oh, we can't get labor, what they mean is that they can't get agricultural laborers at the same or wages that they've been paying Dalit agricultural laborers for decades. That's just an excuse. No, okay. You might not have been talking about this exact situation, but when you say that NRHS takes away the incentive to work, It actually just is doing is pushing up wages. I think the rest of it is just absolute excuse of large farmers, your large exploiting, large landowning farmers that are just justifying, you're just complaining about not being able to get agricultural labor at the same cheap price. There's no shortage of labor. There's a surplus.
Right, that's true. That's true.
Wages
Exactly.
have actually doubled since 2006. They've doubled in states. So when you say agricultural wages, they're not decreasing because of energy. They've actually doubled. So where wages were like 30, 35, today you're getting like 200 rupees in some states.
In some places.
In Andhra, in Rajasthan, you're getting 140. So in Rajasthan, you would have been, you used to get 11 rupees in the 80s. And today,
But what's to prevent the government from, you talk about incentivizing, I mean, what's to prevent the government from actually enlarging the scope of NREGS to actually support labor working on private farms?
there isn't anything to that's the thing.
Because that's the
question. These kinds of questions are not being asked under NREG. In order to expand NREG, everyone's constantly talking about, oh, there's corruption in NREG, let's just shut it down. Okay, the economy.
Right,
That's the
right.
one thing. That
Right.
what is the thing that they want to shut down, and there's the NREG, and then all this hue and cry about bypass the Food Security Act, which is all going to go down again in corruption. So it's that corruption is like you attach it to every welfare scheme, every welfare
Sure.
policy, and that's it. They don't want to. If you want to talk about incentive, they kill the talk of incentive before it even arises. And the kinds of questions that you should be asking in order to make an NREG work where it is not working are not being asked. And so even if in like parts of Karnataka where you're forming unions, where women workers are forming unions, one, to increase women participation rates, push wages higher, those kinds of things are not being talked about. They're not being taken from one part of the country and implemented in another. Accountability mechanisms that are working in one part of the state within the scheme are
Sure.
not being replicated in other parts of the country within that same scheme. And part of it has to do with the fact that you're in a federal system. You have a national legislation with them. And you fair amount of autonomy to the state to implement that
Sure.
law and then federal attention.
No, I mean, I agree with you. I think that NREG is very complex. But I do think, and this is based on talking to a number of wide range of people in rural India, including activists who are working with NREG, is that to the extent that it takes the form of a goal, it becomes a problem. Because it creates dependency. And the same is the criticism of the Food Security Act. To the extent it takes the form of a dole, it creates dependency. And for instance, there's an activist in Uttarakhand I was hearing from who was talking in the context of flood relief that this has a tendency to get institutionalized and actually does kill the incentive to farm. And you become dependent on food supply chains from long distances away. Now,
It's one of the ways of killing all incentive to work.
sorry?
The incentive to work comes from hunger. And so if we're eliminating hunger, and essentially we're decommodifying labor, which seems like an advance in terms of left and
No, I mean, look, if you're giving adequate food for very low prices, and if you have 100 days of work, it does affect the incentive to work. But more to be said.
So, your analysis is really good and very insightful. But just out of curiosity, I wanted to ask you, so like solutions that you advocate, so how are you able to put it into practice in terms of advocacy and what are other measures you take?
You're asking me as in what can be done or what am I doing?
Like how do you manage to contribute to the solution, which you understand?
No, I'm asking you the question, are you asking me how do I do it or how does it do it? How do I do it? I do it by what I know best, which is teaching. I'm not a practitioner. associate with them, I try to learn from them what they're doing, what is working, what is not working, why is it not working, etc. But I'm not a practitioner. I'm trained as an economist, so.
So you're not carrying out any pilot projects or demonstration?
Next question. Yeah.
How far is 2020?
What do you mean?
Because we'd be lucky not India being number one economy by 2020. That's pretty. I mean, this was more of a short question, not a real question.
I think we have to stop being a nation of fantasists. I mean, what can I say? We are a nation of fantasists.
What is the direction the rupee is going to take, in your opinion?
Well, everything depends on what the Fed does at its next meeting. If it reverses its stance from this last meeting to what it was doing in May, the rupee will go down, I think. And if it keeps this stance, it will go up. So that's the extent of sensitivity of our markets to what the Fed does.
So I've heard that our economy is far too much reliant on the service sector and not enough on manufacturing.
Right.
So what is the scope of fixing that distribution?
Well, it's a clever nicety to describe India's economy as a service economy, because you have to break down the service sector into the organized service sector and the informal service sector. A lot of the expansion in the service economy has happened by default, not by either state planning or cooperative government or some such thing. So, for instance, you have a proliferation of very, very small businesses, not even petty retail. You might have Thilawala selling vegetables, and that's service sector. Right? And it's lumped in the same category as information technology, software. Right? So there's a problem there. The data from the 5th economic census shows that India has 42 million non-agricultural enterprises, and they employ 98 million people. So cost 2.3 people per enterprise, and that tells you something about the nature of non-agricultural enterprise in India, which is that it's not in the organized sector at all. It's usually somebody trying to make ends meet in a very difficult situation, not being able to work in agriculture anymore. So the same data can be interpreted as, as the blooming of free enterprise, or it can be seen as a sign of the failure of the system.
So last year I had like a meeting with Nirupama Roy, the ambassador from India, and the general consensus or general direction looks like a climate change denial, right? Either the climate change is not happening, or it's already so worse that we can't do anything about it. And probably we already know that many of the climate change talks in Canton or other places are being stalled, and India being a leader of those group of nations which think that we have right to use oil to develop our economy. So what can be a possible solution out of this large?
I don't know. I just think that there is a lot of lazy thinking in our policy circles, and there isn't the patience or imagination to think of, for instance, alternate sources of energy. The only alternative to fossil fuels they can think of is nuclear energy, which is yet another dangerous way to generate it. The scale of our needs is very different from the scale of our demands. What is needed is something different. For instance, when we think of alternatives, we never ask the question, what is the alternative for, and who is it for? If you go to Jharkhand, you will find some examples of microthermal, which is fed by either coal or by some kind of husk or crop waste or something. Those microthermals are actually quite effective in lighting up a village, but they can't light up Tata Nagar, right? Who does Tata Nagar serve? Not really the village. it's serving the cities. So, it's the big steel plant that needs the super thermal and not the, small village. But everybody has plans for this village, right? And one part of that is to not listen to what villages actually are asking for, which is often just the freedom to be left alone. I've had farmers say to me from Maharashtra, we just want the freedom to farm. If that's what we want to do, why is the government telling us to give up farming, etc. There will be an energy crisis if we keep playing cricket under the lights, if we keep lights on during the day in big glass and chrome buildings in Gurgaon. There will be an energy crisis here. So that's why I said the scale of our demands is different from the scale of our needs. We should make the distinction and with energy alternatives ask the question, who is it for and what is it for? And I think that will usually clarify. It's not just about increasing the installed capacity of the country. Energy crisis has been with us, if you read the planning document, it's been with us all the way since 1947. And it's part of the game in order to entice investment, to show that, there is a demand here. Climate change, what can I say? We like to be very moral before the rest of the world, and we hide behind the poor. And in the name of the poor, we get a growth strategy which is constantly benefiting the rich. And the footprint of the rich is orders of magnitude greater than the footprint of the poor. So you have to break it down. Don't accept the category of the nation. Break it down by social classes, and then you see a very different picture of where the responsibility actually lies.
All right, I think we should.
I think we have to stop. Yeah. Thank you.